Morning. Yeah. We actually did some rearranging, so we did get a few more rows in.
Good, because I think it's going to be, as long as the air conditioning holds out, we're fine.
Yeah. So Zahid was joking. He said if we have too many people, it will be a developing country workshop in a developing country.
Slide açtı ama direkt masa üstüne açtı. Sen arkamdan açacaksın aç. Sen yoksun ya, açayım mı dedi.
Sen programdan nasıl açılacağını bilmiyor musun?
Biliyorum da işte o an şimdi uğraşamıyorum. Ay ay ay.
İnternetine gitmiş ya.
Saçım çok mu kötü ya?
Neden?
Saçım çok mu kötü?
Niye? Başak şuradan yine bağlansana, çıktım ben. Düştüm büyük ihtimalle. Gireyim de.
Nasıl şey yapıyor?
Dur.
Yok bu değil mi işte?
Tamam, beni şey yap. Ben kendim yaptım. Post. Kamera nasıl olacak?
You can put the slide off if you want, that's fine. Yeah? Just minimize it. No, just exit the things. And just minimize it as well, we don't want it on here. Nice. Perfect. down, but we don't need to do that. We can leave them on, that's fine. Okay?
Şimdi turn down, turn off.
No, no, it's perfect.
Okay.
Okay?
Never.
Yeah.
Bir şey söyleyeyim mi?
Fine. Not violent.
So good morning, everybody. I thought I'd try to wake people up. As you probably know, slide 2, I don't know how you're going to fix that, but I think there's something wrong with the screen. Maybe if you go to slide 2, thank you. So if everybody knows Lord of the Rings, what we're going to do today is, after the success of last year's workshop, focus on, this is a capacity building session, so focus basically on the questions and issues that developing countries have. One of the biggest ones that law enforcement, when they fight cybercrime in developing countries, is how do I get data? And how do I get cooperation cross-border? So I thought I'd sort of spice it up in the morning. The example we're going to use is fictional because I don't think it's safe for me to take an actual country's name. So I thought maybe we'd use something like that. Not that basically cybercrime or cyber war would lead to this, but nonetheless. Moving on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to jump right into this so that I'm done talking in about 10, well, maybe 20 minutes, etc. And then we're going to get to the panel. You can see this is the fictional sort of, those people who are familiar with Lord of the Rings. There's Rohan on the left-hand corner at the top, and Gondor, which has access to the sea. The scenario we're trying to build is that Gondor basically, Rohan is landlocked and Gondor has access to the sea. So the undersea cable, which I'll mention in a second, comes to Gondor and feeds basically the internet traffic into Rohan. So that's just to give you a geographic perspective. Moving on. And these are developing countries. So the Republic of Gondor, with the one that's on the coast, it's a member of the UN, it's a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, it's a member of the ITU, it's a member of the World Trade Organization, not that in this context it matters, UNODC as well, and that's just our logo on the side. Anyway, moving to the next one. You'll keep saying that, unfortunately. I think it's too big. I don't know what happened with the calibration. So Gondor has the Gondor National Bank. It has GonTel, which is its largest cellular phone operator. It's using 3G, 4G, so there's no question of not having internet bandwidth. It has mobile banking, and basically not just using SMS, but basically it's also using IP, which means it's online, because it has 3G, 4G as well. On the right-hand corner, if you can see it, for some reason we have things on, anyway, that's the undersea cable that gets to Gondor, and the idea is that it's basically a more developed country, and its neighbor Rohan is sort of relying to some extent, at least on the internet traffic and other things. It has challenges. Moving to the next slide. Next, okay. So what's happening is that GNB, and I didn't want to change the logos there, but GNB, which is the Gondor National Bank, and GonTel have been, their customers have been sort of getting emails or messages where the banks, I mean, this is a phishing email. This is the sort of typical email they get. So you click on that, and next slide. If you click on that, you end up at another bank's website, or I mean the same, allegedly the same bank's website, which is a spoofed website. It asks you to enter your account details, your password. That's typically the way how these things are done. And a phishing email leads to people trying to basically get your personal information, account details, and then they empty your account. That's what's basically been going on. So GonTel and Gondor, GNB are facing this crisis next. Well, so you can do IP traces. This is not the one that has to do Rohan because, well, I can't find Rohan in Google Maps. But in any case, an IP trace figures out that it's leading to Rohan, which is the neighboring country. So Gondor's pretty upset. GNB is upset. It's going to its government saying, somebody's got to do something about this. And the minister's getting upset. This affects our finances, confidence in our mobile banking system. We need to do something about this immediately. Okay. But remember this. When you trace an IP, that doesn't mean that's actually the originating IP necessarily. People can be using VPNs. There are providers I won't take names of that actually mask the IP in their email headers. Next slide, please. So when Rohan law enforcement was asked, Rohan law enforcement said, no, I'm sorry, I will not give you any data. Because the first thing that the government in Gondor said was, could you hand over your ISP's data? We want to sort of track and trace, and we want to get traffic data, anything else you can provide. So they just turned around and said, sorry, we're just not going to help you. That happens all the time in the world. Next. Gondor itself, even though it's a pretty advanced nation to the extent that it's, technology, et cetera, and all that, it doesn't have a cybercrime law yet. So somehow it has to fight this battle possibly with the use of existing sort of traditional legislation. Oh yeah, please come in. There's lots of room up here, so please come through. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to pause here for a second and think about, and for everyone here to think about, and then we'll go to the panel as well on bits and pieces and come back to the audience. Keeping this sort of scenario in mind, I won't take names of certain regions, but I'm familiar with several regions that have precisely these kind of problems in certain continents. Now, what kind of things can law enforcement and governments do to try and get cooperation to track down these criminals? The first one could be informal cooperation. I don't need an agreement, it's not a treaty, nothing. The problem with an informal cooperation is that it's discretionary. So Rohan just simply says, sorry, I'm not going to help you. It's faster, that's an advantage, but it seldom works, not all the time. So, and whatever you get from informal cooperation is information. It's not evidence. You can't take it to court. You can't prosecute somebody with it. It will not stand the test of evidence and admissibility in any court of law that I'm aware of. It's usually an uneven playing field because, you know, if you're a small, little, insignificant, developing country, I mean, I'm from Pakistan. If my law enforcement asks sometimes for data from Europe or other places, it's not necessarily going to get it. And a lot of times, developing countries, this is the basic problem we're trying to address, because this was asked in last year's workshop, was, you know, what do we do about getting data from developed countries, or as I like to call them, infrastructure countries? Being developed is one thing, but the main thing is you have the infrastructure, you have the servers. That's why people want to be able to get your data. Next. So examples of these are, you know, the G8 24/7 network, which actually does a pretty good job. Again, it's not evidence, but it helps in the fight in providing information and intelligence. Interpol, again, it is a chartered institution, so it has an agreement. It's sort of like a treaty, not really, but it doesn't focus on evidence collection just like a mutual legal assistance treaty would do. So it's just information exchange again. You cannot necessarily take stuff you get from Interpol to the court. It would have to go through the proper channels of mutual legal assistance in the individual countries. They can just try and coordinate that for you. Impact, which is something that was started in Malaysia. Again, informal, you know, once a flash in the pan sort of situations at times. APWG is doing actually a great job, but it's very focused. It says anti-phishing working group. So where phishing emails are coming, they're collecting data and they're letting people know, you know, what are the threats, so they can actually either in their spam folders or others basically try and address those things. So that's helpful. But it doesn't catch the criminal. So what's the other way that you can try and sort of address this? You could probably try to have a formal cooperation process, like a treaty or a convention. Countries sign that. Usually these are bilateral, so the US has several, many other countries, UK has several, mutual legal assistance treaties in criminal matters only. So the purpose of a mutual legal assistance treaty is not extradition. It's simply to say that we will, on a reciprocal basis, exchange evidence and information and help each other in trying to basically, in criminal matters. Trouble with that is some of the provisions in existing MLATs are archaic, they're pretty old. So they don't allow for expedited preservation necessarily, they don't allow for digital evidence and many other problems. So, and also they're very, very slow. This is one of the challenges with the mutual legal assistance treaty process, but some countries are trying to do something about that, so we'll talk about that in a while. Not always lead to cooperation, sometimes because in a global crime area, if you're bilateral, it's just me and you talking and the criminal sitting in a third country, good luck, there's not much you can do. And if you were to try and start signing up bilateral MLATs, you'd have to do it one at a time with every single country, and that's just a very long, grueling process, and it's a negotiation. Sometimes they don't look the same. So it needs a cyber solution, it needs modernization. You don't want to go one country at a time. And so some people say, well, fine, okay, why don't we in a region try and come up with a treaty? What about South Asia? Let's have a SARC cybercrime treaty. Why don't we have an African Union Convention treaty? I mean, maybe let's try to solve this regionally. What about the South? What about Caribbean? What about other places? And the challenge there is that this is a global crime. So if Gondar and Rohan in their region, the example we gave earlier, have a regional treaty that they're signed up to, but if the emails were routing through, say, the US or another country, then you can forget about getting that information because they're not party to that treaty. Why would they help you? So what you need is something which is international, which is global, where, and especially those countries, those countries that are holding the data, they're the ones who would cooperate or be party to it. So It's fine for us in regions as developing countries necessarily to say, we all agree, but we don't hold the data. The data sometimes elsewhere. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Ooh.
There's a technical problem, so we have
Okay,
to wait
we'll
a
wait.
little. There is no connection.
There's no connection. Okay, sorry. So that happens sometimes. We could start and run the movie. A little more live action. So there have been these situations where, for instance, I've gone into regions where we as the Developing Countries Center for Cybercrime have tried and provide legislative drafting, capacity building in that regard. And everybody comes back and says, but if me and my neighbor agree, doesn't that sort of solve the problem? And the answer is no. So let's take a look at examples of treaties. The United Nations is one. Whoops, sorry, go back please. Yep. So these are examples of treaties that, or soft treaties or treaties that may exist, or places that one could try and go to. So think about Gondor and Rohan trying to cooperate. Remember, the Gondor is a member of the UN, it's a member of the ITU, it's a member of the Commonwealth, and it's also signed up to the UNODC. Now, if you were signed up to all these treaties, you would still not be able to get cooperation. Why? Because none of these organizations have a cybercrime instrument treaty as yet. The closest one, I think, would have been the UNODC, because it deals with crime, but it doesn't deal with cybercrime in digital evidence. And it's really slow. Again, there's huge challenges with that. That takes months and years sometimes. The SCO, which is right in the center, has tried to do something. It says, but they're just principles that those countries have agreed to. They don't provide a framework in which developing countries can cooperate amongst themselves. And then there's the African Union Convention that recently has been talked about cybersecurity. Again, it's limited to the region, but again, it doesn't have the sufficient international cooperation provisions. If you look at it, it talks about data protection, electronic transactions, some bits on cybersecurity and cybercrime, but it doesn't have the framework that you would expect. What I'd like to do is stop here for a second and ask one of our participants here on the panel, because that's what I'll do. I'll flash back and forth, and then we'll have them also do an intervention. Jayanta, who's also from Sri Lanka, and ask him, what do you think about, you're a Commonwealth country, I come from a Commonwealth country, I think Margaret, of course, you're from a Commonwealth country. What can the Commonwealth do in this scenario, for instance?
We're no longer part of the Commonwealth.
And the US is not, just to be clear.
Thank you, Zahid. So I'm Jayanta Fernando. I'm a lawyer from Sri Lankan government. So with reference to your case, and by the way, Zahid, is your case up on the web yet? Yeah. So he mentioned an interesting case study which we were privy to at least a couple of hours before we started. So with reference to Commonwealth and the frameworks that are available, let me give some background to what came out of our own experience. In the formulation of our Sri Lankan legislative framework, which started in the late 1990s and went on through 2001, first review, 2003, second review, 2005, third review, and then 2007, it was enacted by Parliament. In all these reviews, the country, Sri Lanka, had multiple options to look at. Yes, we are part of the Commonwealth, and we had the Commonwealth model law on computer crime, as they call it, right? So we looked at that, and as a part of the Commonwealth, we also looked up to jurisdictions like Singapore and UK that had adopted frameworks, and those were pretty well acceptable within the Commonwealth jurisdictions. However, in the second review, or the first review, the latter part of 2001 and early 2002, we realized that this issue is becoming bigger than what we could imagine, and the threat of cybercrime could go beyond the parameters of Commonwealth countries. And then we came across an available tool that was brought to our attention, namely the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. And Sri Lanka became a country that looked at this option that was available. Well, we were not a European country, and we understood from the literature available that this was a treaty that was available for non-European countries to potentially sign and accede. And we had no link to the Council of Europe at that time. So nevertheless, we went on to look at this template, the available tool, and it looked very good, and it provided for mutual assistance, legal cooperation in a most effective manner. And what we did was we incorporated provisions in the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime into our national legislation in the best way possible. And when we introduced the law in 2007, which became the Computer Crimes Act number 24 of 2007, it incorporated the features of the Budapest Convention, especially the provisions governing mutual assistance and cooperation. Now, one last point I just want to highlight is in relation to the Commonwealth. What we did was, in the Computer Crimes Act, there is a specific provision that incorporates by reference the provisions of what is known as the mutual assistance in criminal and mutual assistance in criminal matters Act number 25 of 2002 in our country, which incorporates the provisions, the mutual legal assistance provisions emanating or coming from the Harare Convention. Now, although that was incorporated by reference, we felt that Commonwealth by itself does not adopt binding conventions which require formal ratification. Countries have the options to do so. Countries do not, if they do not want to, they don't have to do that. So that was the issue that we had. So so
basically what you're saying is it wasn't binding necessarily, but you went for another option, as you mentioned. So the ITU is, again, let me just sort of come back to this. The ITU, for instance, as a technical organization, doesn't do criminal justice, for instance. And those are the kind of stuff. Let's go to the next slide, Zara. So what does it need? You need a formal international obligation within countries so that they can actually officially, formally, in an obligation manner, cooperate. It must catch up with the speed of the informal process, because the informal process is very good because it's faster. The formal process is slower. We need to have something that's slightly faster in the formal process. It must also take care of human rights, because one of the things you want to make sure is that this is not a cooperation that is basically violative of civil liberties and the UN Declaration of Human Rights and other ICCPR, for instance. And that there must be trust amongst the different countries, that they will ask for the correct kind of information and not abuse it or misuse it, and that when they are requested, they will respond. Well, they're obliged to under international law. This would obviously be limited to criminal justice. Next slide, please. One of the things you'd want the convention to do, in the case of Gondar we saw, for instance, the Gondar did not have a cybercrime legislation. So one of the first things you need to do is make sure that in every country, this kind of activity, that phishing that we saw in the example, needs to be criminalized. It can't be technology specific, because it's phishing today, spoofing, whatever, botnets, zombies. We're not going to, it's very bad. I think it's a bad practice trying to find crimes by taking the title we give them, and instead with the legislation to be drafted in a technology non-specific manner. Not have everything or else no consensus. There should be a baseline that everybody adopts. It should be an inclusive treaty, open to everybody, not restricted to certain regions or certain countries, so everybody should be able to come in and adopt them. Procedures in how you will cooperate should be harmonized. There should be cross-border procedures and cooperation, and it shouldn't be mutually exclusive but complementary to other forms of treaties. So if I have in my country, if there's a SARC treaty and I have signed up to a regional treaty, for instance, not that one exists, that shouldn't mean I can't sign up to another one. And it should be inclusive and not exclusive. And it should include those members, this is I think the most important, where the data resides. Because otherwise there's no point in you being a member if the people who you want to get the data from are not part of that treaty. That's the most important key aspect of any treaty or any agreement that you would sign. Next slide, please. And the majority of the requests flow, and I don't like to call them, I'm from the developing country, but I don't like to call it to developing. It's infrastructure states, because there's sometimes you can find countries which are not necessarily completely developed, but have the infrastructure, and the information needs to flow to developing countries which require that information. So to think about it in slightly less about developed and developing and more about who's got the infrastructure, are they a party to this agreement, that becomes key. Next. So you mentioned the Budapest Convention, actually, Jayanta. So yes, I've put that up on the slide as well. That is the only convention currently that exists which has all these things we just talked about. The other ones don't. Next slide, please. And I want to close, this is, I think, probably my last slide. One of the things when we work with developing countries, we sort of say, forget any international politics or, you know, what we can get if we sign the treaty, but focus, and when you talk to law enforcement, that happens most of the time, what do I get if I join the treaty? So for developing country law enforcement, the biggest answer to their problem of not getting cooperation is you will get cooperation. So it's effectively, if you look at it from that perspective, in the sovereign national interest of law enforcement in those countries, their own interest, that when they sign up to this, they are serving that particular interest. So you should target, you know, what is practical, what is achievable, what benefits developing countries, and what can benefit you now. Because there could be a treaty tomorrow, there could be a treaty 5, 10 years ago, 10 years hence, which could be better, I don't know. But if you have something now, the answer for most countries in the developed world would be, developing world would be to sign up to what exists currently. So no time to waste. Next slide, please. Oh, we'll skip this, thank you. So what I wanted to do, this is our address and session, and I've taken too much time now. I think I'm at least 5 minutes over time, so I'll stop. You can take the slide, well, leave the slide up there. What I'd like to do now is ask Chris Painter, who's here from the State Department and who's head of cyber issues, that, you know, the mutual legal assistance treaty process is criticized sometimes with the state saying it takes too long. What is the US doing about this, and what are your views generally maybe about what you've just seen?
So I'll start with that second part and then go into the specifics of mutual legal assistance. You know, I've been, before I came to the State Department, for many years I was a federal prosecutor doing cybercrime cases and have been involved in lots of investigations over the years. And so I've seen a lot of this firsthand, and I'd say that you need a combination of different tools as you approach these kinds of investigations, because the data, as was said earlier, the data doesn't necessarily last very long, and it can go through several different jurisdictions. And you're a developing world country, you're Gondor, and you find that, Rohan, and you find that you have, you're trying to get this data, and it could be traced back to one country, but really, as you mentioned in the hypothetical, it could come from yet another country, and maybe a third. And you know, smart cyber criminals will often route their attacks, their communications, their phishing, their fraud through several different countries, because they're trying to take advantage of the fact that there is uneven laws in different countries and uneven procedures in different countries. And so you know, there are a couple things that are really important. One, for every country really to have base cybercrime laws. And as you mentioned, the Council of Europe, or the Budapest Convention that was really hosted by the Council of Europe, but many more countries are members of it than those countries. And it's not really, you know, some people say it's a regional convention. It's not a regional convention, really it's a global convention. More and more countries are joining all the time. And the benefit of that is it sets out what some of those, the floor is, what some substantive provisions you need to have in your laws, what some procedural provisions, and also provides a mechanism for formal cooperation and informal cooperation. This, you know, 24/7 cooperation and using mutual legal assistance sort of authorities. And as you investigate these crimes, you have to do a couple things. One, you have to take advantage of the informal networks, and you mentioned the limitations of those, particularly as evidence, but using things like the 24/7 network, which is now over 60 countries, to do a fast freeze of evidence, make sure that the evidence can be preserved, so when you come back later on with the legal process, it's still there. So that's one of the real benefits of doing that fast cooperation. You can follow it up with the more formal cooperation where you can get the evidence, et cetera, for that. And also informally, doing the investigation helps you get back to the actual origin of some of these attacks, so you can get the evidence from them as well. Right. And that's important. So you marry that up with the more formal cooperation, and I think you're quite right. I think the problem with mutual legal assistance requests and treaties in the past have been that people perceive them, and they are, relatively slow. They were written at a time when people were writing in quill pens and doing, not all of them, frankly, but they're a very old way of cooperating. And they made sense in a world that wasn't digital. And they made sense in a world where you had the time to find records sometimes months later. That's not true in the digital world. That doesn't mean we throw that out, because that kind of mutual legal assistance is really grounded in laws around the world and bilateral agreements. And even though a lot of the mutual legal assistance treaties are not specifically cyber, they're about classes of different kinds of crimes. So you can still get cooperation under them. And the US has about 100 bilateral mutual legal assistance treaties around the world, with lots of countries, obviously. So on one level, you want to do things that will make that mutual legal assistance process easier. And there are two things you do. Bilaterally, so let's say you're a country that's not a member of the Budapest Convention. Well, and you have there's a bilateral treaty in place, or there's a memorandum, something that's less than a bilateral mutual legal assistance treaty. It's still pretty slow. So how do we do that? And one of the reasons for an infrastructure country, as you mentioned, they may get lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of requests from all over the world, and they don't have lots and lots and lots and lots of law enforcement officers to handle all of them, or people in their justice departments. We recognized that in the U.S. when President Obama, back in January, he said in a speech one of the core things he wanted the U.S. to do was to streamline the mutual legal assistance process, recognizing these concerns, asking our Congress to fund a lot more money, $24 million, to go to our Justice Department to expand the number of people who actually do this so we can speed this up. Do some outreach and training around the world that would help streamline these requests as well. And so that's a real commitment. We really do think this is important, because it's important to the developed and the developing world, and we're all better off by strengthening that system. The other thing I'd say is there's also we talk about capacity building, there's also a training aspect of this as well, because sometimes requests come in and they're, tell me everything you have on this IP address. And they don't really give you either enough information, right, or data to actually help fulfill that request. And so what happens is then people go back and ask for more data, and then there's a delay when they come back, and it's back and forth. So it's important. There are lots of resources out there that talk about what kinds of data are important so the request is complete, and that streamlines the process too. So that's some of the outreach and training that you do as we do capacity building around the world. And we've done, for instance, seminars with the East African community, the West ECOWAS, just recently with SADC in Botswana, where we talk about some of these issues so that helps streamline it. The other thing I'd say is the gold standard, though, as you mentioned, is the Budapest Convention, because that has provisions within it about substantive law, procedural law, cooperation, and mutual legal assistance. And that allows you, under that framework, to really work together more speedily and get that information you need. So that really is a foundational pillar, I think, to have that. And our position is best practice, sign on to that convention, as we have. If you can't do that right away, start emulating its provisions in your law. You won't get the full advantage of the mutual legal assistance provisions, but at least you'll be part of an international system where there's similarities so that you can work together. But the gold standard is still there.
Thank you so much. Margaret, Margaret is with the National Crime Agency in Ghana. You come from a developing country like many others on this panel. What has your experience been where informal cooperation mechanisms, have they worked well? And what is your view about formal cooperation mechanisms, like Christopher was just talking about? If you sign up to a treaty, how would that help you in a developing country context, for instance?
My name is Margaret, just like he mentioned, but I don't work with the National Cybercrime organization.
agency.
I work with the regulator and
Communication Authority.
we have a National Anti-Fraud Task Force that deals with this crime. And the cooperation, we've had so many cooperation with maybe the U.S. State Department. We also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Commonwealth Secretary. But when it comes to informal cooperation, though Ghana is yet to accede to the Budapest Convention, the Council of Europe has helped in so many ways. For example, this year, in March, the Council of Europe, we requested for training from them for our judges and our prosecutors and investigators, and they so graciously sponsored a 4-day training workshop for the judges, the prosecutors, the investigators from the Criminal Investigations Department of our police service. And in fact, it was something I was even surprised because we haven't acceded to the Budapest Convention yet, but they willingly came to organize and fully sponsor this training workshop in Ghana, and it was a huge success. And I want to use this platform. We are even asking for more of such trainings from the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexander, everybody seems to be talking about where you come from. Alexander Seeger from the Council of Europe has very important, I'll let him explain what he does in the Cybercrime Convention. But let me challenge you a bit. I mean, so that you have this convention, but in the example you saw of Gondor and Rohan, you know, what is in the treaty that would help those countries? I mean, does it really work?
Well, none of these two countries is probably party to any of the relevant treaties, otherwise they would have legislation in place and they would have a number of other things in place. Taking that example, let's be realistic. You can get started and you can cooperate to a certain extent by using existing legislation by analogy, you know, fraud provisions in this case or other provisions. You can work on the basis of bilateral MLA agreements, like you mentioned. You can work by reciprocity. You can use all sorts of informal channels, at least to get intelligence, and so on. So you can get to a certain point. But if now you have a situation where another country does not want to cooperate or simply refuses to cooperate by taking a formal position, you have a problem. And that is the situation. That is the situation here. We have to recognize that. I would like to make a more general statement now, also in relation to what you said, that these countries are relying on ICT, on the financial sector for the development. We have to look at ICT, and many countries do look at ICT as a development strategy. We had a series of 8 workshops the other week, last month actually, in Mauritius. Because Mauritius joined the Budapest Convention, now we provide capacity building assistance to Mauritius, and they have really developed ICT to the point that I think is now the 3rd most important pillar of their economy. And many countries want to follow a similar example. So we have to look at measures against cybercrime as a contribution to human development, to economic and social development, to human rights and the rule of law altogether. We have to look at it like that. It also means we should not support measures that would run counter to these objectives. Like you said, we have to respect human rights, rule of law. I think I would even go a step further and said we should not only avoid violating human rights and the rule of law, or principles of rule of law, we should consider measures against cybercrime as a positive contribution to human rights and the rule of law in cyberspace. So I have a positive approach there. If now both countries were parties to the Budapest Convention, let's look ahead, you know, and if you give us the government's addresses of these two countries, we'll certainly contact them to see what can be done. They would certainly have legislation in place, because parties have to have legislation in place. It's not just a treaty that's signed up to and then there is no follow-up to it. They would have legislation in place. They would be part not just of a treaty, they would be part of a whole system. Meaning, yes, a treaty, a formal framework for cooperation, but also be party to the Cybercrime Convention Committee, which meets twice a year, which has working groups, meets all the time actually. That is also right now evaluating the effectiveness of the international cooperation provisions. So we have them in the treaty, yes, but we're also evaluating right now the effectiveness of these provisions in practice. That may lead possibly to another protocol to the Budapest Convention with additional provisions to make international cooperation even more effective. As a party, you participate in the negotiation of these additional options. They would also benefit from capacity building programs, because we realize a country may sign up to the treaty, may have the formal legislation in place, but you need to do more. You need to follow up with training. You need to follow up with providing guidance, developing guidelines with those countries, help countries set up high-tech crime units, help countries develop, help high-tech crime units develop operating procedures, and so forth. So you would join a whole system here. There was one point you made about the national interest question. It's actually an interesting one, because some countries come and say, yeah, you know, we don't mind about the Budapest Convention, but we did not participate in the preparation of it. We did not participate in the negotiation, and as a matter of policy, we are not joining a treaty that we did not participate in the preparation. Okay, there are 2 points here, 3 points actually. Is there an alternative right now? Maybe there will be one in many years, but right now it's difficult to see any alternative. So I would say that right now there are so many different interests regarding cyberspace that it's very difficult to come to any agreement on anything these days. And it's certainly not possible these days to come to an agreement on a new or an additional treaty. So the strength of the Budapest Convention, it's there. It's there and it's functioning, and it's been there and functioning for the past 12 years. The second thing, parties that join later, that join now, like Mauritius, like Panama recently, like Dominican Republic that joined not so long ago, these countries are now participating in the negotiation of possibly additional protocols to the convention. So they participate in the further development of this treaty. And the third one is a very interesting point, the national interest one. Again, the same countries that tell us, oh, we don't join as a matter of principle such a treaty, the Budapest Convention, because we did not participate in the negotiation, they sign another Council of Europe treaty, namely the one on administrative cooperation in tax matters, because they believe it's important to get money back from tax evasion. So that treaty they joined, they don't say, oh, we didn't participate in the elaboration. So we have many countries, non-European countries, that signed up and ratified that treaty. But when it comes to the Budapest Convention, oh, you know, we did not join, we did not participate 13, 14 years ago. Anyway, countries get different messages and confusing messages from international organizations. That is a big problem. I think international organizations have to make an effort to come to a more coherent position when they advise countries around the world. I think it's owed to the taxpayers who pay for organizations. Yeah, I think I would leave it at this for the moment.
So I want to come to Audrey and get a private perspective, but I just wanted to ask Jayantha on, I know I actually interrupted you while you were saying something, but very quickly, could you tell me, Jayantha, you're a developing country, you want to accede to this treaty. I mean, why? Is it in your national interest? I mean, we just heard that there's conversations, and why not wait for something more global? You know, something that's a UN. I mean, is this or is this not global? How do you feel about that?
Yeah. Starting from that point where I think Alexander stopped, as a country which is looking at empowering the citizens with digital options, and a country that is moving from perhaps a pure agricultural-based economy to a knowledge economy. We see an environment where there's substantial investment both from the government and the private sector towards the growth of the ICT sector. And as a country which has moved up the ladder in terms of the knowledge economy status, we feel that ICT development measures would add substantial economic value to the country. Now, when you empower a country or make a country digitally enabled and ensure that the country's economic growth is contingent on that digital empowerment, we need to have an effective tool and a measure where we can collaborate other countries on an equal footing and get the best in terms of judicial cooperation, law enforcement cooperation. And that is the reason why we are looking at the Budapest Convention as the option.
But why not wait for something more global like the UN or ITU or someplace else? Why not?
Yeah, so, the changing landscape of cybercrime is such that there is no time to waste. Right? There is no time to waste. So we need to get on with the act fast, and we have an available tool and an option that's on the table.
Audrey, I'm really sorry. I'm just going to go back. But I don't understand. I mean, you can have a treaty in 2 years, 3 years maybe. How long would it take? Somebody want to answer that one? Yeah. Why not? I mean, let the UN try to fix this problem.
I can start answering that because I was involved in negotiating the Budapest Convention, and that took 5 years. And you know, I would expect it would take at least 5 years. And the bench is not very deep in this area. You know, they're not, you know, the resources of people who understand cybercrime, not diplomats, but people who actually understand, and diplomats are great people, I'm a diplomat, right? But people who actually understand cybercrime and cybercrime laws would be needed to help negotiate some new treaty, and it would take years, and you lose, you could lose 5 years of actually going after all of this crime, and you know, as Alexander said, this is important to the developing countries, not just because it's good to have good laws in place, but it helps to get investment in your country, it helps your economy, it enhances human rights, it does all these benefits to your country if you have these strong laws in place, and if you wait all that time, you know, that you're losing out. And the second thing is, you know, this is a floor, not a ceiling. The floor means there's commonality if you have the Budapest Convention, and you can have things on top of that. But if you take the time to negotiate a new treaty, it may not be as strong as this, and there may be lots of compromises that take place, and you really won't be able to get at the heart of some of the problems we're seeing.
Alexander, it sounds like you'd have something to say. How long would it take?
It will take 30 seconds, but I just want to check one thing now in the transcript.
How long would the treaty?
Now my name is Now my name is correct, because before that my name was listed as Marco Pancini. I don't want to commit Google to all those statements.
And Isabel Martinez is not on the panel, just to be clear.
Okay, just about time frames. Budapest Convention the actual negotiation took 5 years. There were another 8 years preceding that of negotiations. It makes 13 years. We are now 13 or 14 years later, we have 42 parties. So you have to think in 25-year time frames for having, this is serious. Even when you talk about the protocol to the convention, you take 2-3 years to agree that you need a protocol, the preparatory work. You need another 2-3-4 years to negotiate it. You are now at 5-6 years. And then you need at least 10 years for a sufficient number of countries to have ratified that, because it all has to go through domestic parliaments, be transposed into domestic legislation. So you talk about 15, 20, 25-year time frame. If you start with a new treaty that is meaningful, then 25 years to have it in place and functioning is a realistic time frame. And what do you do in the meantime?
All right, so the criminals are going to love that one. Everybody just keeps waiting. So you talked about investment, Christopher. You talked about how important it is that these things are in place. And what is the private sector's view about the importance of treaties? We saw Gondor had a GNB, a Gondor National Bank, that was being impacted. We saw Gontel, a telecom operator. These are both private entities, right? They were being impacted. They were the victims of these crimes. I mean, so how does the private sector view the importance or not of the cybercrime legislation, for one, and whether people should be talking to each other for cooperating?
Thanks. I'm Audrey Plunk from int'l. Just a couple points to reinforce all things that have already been said, but from a slightly different perspective. So very fundamentally, 25 years from now, the computing landscape will be completely different than what we're talking about today. So the idea, and even 5 years from now, the computing landscape, the internet landscape, connected devices, it will be completely different. So the idea that you can wait even what might seem like a small amount of time, I think is a misnomer, just from looking at the pace of innovation and the rate at which the private sector is building new things, software, hardware, the Internet of Things, a variety, mobile computing, everything. So I think it's, from a private sector perspective, it's completely irrational to wait 5 years and inconceivable to wait 25. Just as a basic matter. With regard to investment and stability, I think what you generally see is that a stable legal instruments and a somewhat predictable environment with regard to criminal enforcement, it spurs a lot of different things. It not only inspires foreign direct investment, but it also provides a platform for local innovation, creation, and ultimately for economic growth, because that's what is the promise of the internet, as we've seen in the past, and what I think many countries that are developing and continuing to develop their internet ecosystem are looking for continued economic benefits. And so the private sector will naturally gravitate toward jurisdictions and economies where there are stable legal frameworks with regard to cybercrime, and they will invest there, they will enable the local ecosystem there, and they will gravitate away from places that don't have a predictable legal environment for innovation to grow, just because we all know that crime is bad for the economy, and so I don't need to talk about that.
Thanks, Audrey. Mark, did you want to come in?
I wanted to add that whilst, even if it takes 5 years, whilst waiting for during the 5 years, whilst you go to your parliament to decide, whilst you are thinking about your legislation and things like that, the Council of Europe doesn't sit down idle. Just like the example I gave of Ghana, we are now trying to decide, but the Council of Europe will come to your aid when the need arises, just like giving you capacity building, helping you to with other things in connection with the cybercrime. Thank you.
Thank you. Just I'm going to go to Jayantha in a second, but so my understanding, and correct me, Alexander, because you're the expert on this, not me, but of the convention is that what it would do is provide certain procedural powers which don't otherwise exist in legislation and also cross-border cooperation, and they don't exist in international treaties currently. So MLATs, most of them currently don't have the ability to say, I'm going to call somebody up on a 24/7 network and say, listen, there's data on your ISP, could you please freeze it? This is not something you can do on a current MLAT that usually exists between countries, and you cannot ask for the disclosure of digital evidence most of the time because the legislation or the treaty doesn't necessarily provide for that. So I understand that. I also understand now the delay issue. What I want to do now is open it up to the audience and ask questions. And if you had specific questions about the example, not the movie, I might be in copyright infringement, but anyhow, not fair use, fair use. We'll talk about the movie in a second. But Jayantha, you'll have the last word before we go back to the audience. So Jayantha, go ahead.
Just to add to what Margaret said and what Audrey mentioned earlier, in consulting the private sector, And we consulted the private sector extensively at the time of formulating the legislation. And if we, in a country that is trying to promote itself as a destination for IT, BPO, knowledge outsourcing processes kind of activity, we find that signing up to a Budapest Convention model helps a country effectively promote itself as a destination for outsourcing by itself. And second point on that is that when we get into a framework like the Budapest Convention, you have a whole range of access to legal jurisprudence, especially in the area of privacy and data protection. Right. That is hugely essential to a country that is going in the technology direction, especially in the area of e-government, and our government is drawing on the best practices, including from Europe, in the privacy data protection area. And that is a huge benefit arising from signing to an arrangement or accessing to the Budapest Convention.
So I thought I understood this. This was about cybercrime, but we just talked about data protection and human rights. Why do we care about that? This is about catching criminals, no matter what. What does the Council of Europe bring that has to do with privacy or anything, Alexander? I mean, I'm a little confused. I'm sorry, I want the answer to this question before we go back out.
Well, I mentioned before that we have to be clear about the rationale of why we are doing certain things and why we have to invest resources in dealing with cybercrime. One rationale is the economic development rationale, if you want, that also Audrey referred to. But the other rationale is that, and we look at it from the Council of Europe perspective like this, that we deal with cybercrime because it undermines human rights, the rule of law, and democracy, actually. Because if you talk about freedom of assembly and many other things, freedom of expression, we also have to talk about democracy. And because cybercrime undermines these objectives, which happen to be the core objectives of the Council of Europe felt obliged many years ago, 25 years ago, to start work on the cybercrime issue, which then joined in negotiations of the Budapest Convention and the adoption and so on. It is very important, also if you talk about trust and confidence, also trust from the private sector, but also trust by individuals in ICT and in what the government is doing, that all these measures are based on clear legislation, that there are conditions and safeguards, etc., which we call the Article 15 issue in the Budapest Convention. Article 15 means that procedural powers for law enforcement have to be limited, have to be subject to conditions and safeguards. What we see in practice is that many countries that deal with cybercrime legislation, that reform the legislation, also start working on the data protection legislation. So there we then can come in with some additional instruments that we have with the Council of Europe, including Convention 108 on data protection. So we often provide also then advice to countries on data protection because they request it.
Just in addition to that, so I think that there's often a narrative that says you either have security or you have privacy, and you can't possibly have both together because if you're providing security, you're inherently violating somebody's privacy. And so there's some truth to that, or it wouldn't be the story that we like to tell ourselves. But it's much more nuanced than that. So if you think of this in terms of mutually reinforcing concepts instead of mutually exclusive concepts. So the reality is that you can't have any privacy if you don't have some security. So that's and to Alexander's point that this is an enabling concept. So it's not that you shouldn't have, you know, that one particular legal instrument will get you everything you need. But one thing I think is guaranteed, that if there aren't legal instruments around criminal activity with regard to cyberspace, you can pretty much forego any long-term concept of privacy, because They will be accessing data, stealing credit card information, whatever the case is be. And those are all private, regardless of how you define privacy, and this is not a privacy panel. But you can think of those as ultimately getting access to somebody's personal data that is identifiable to that person, and we generally think of that as a privacy issue. So I think it's helpful more to think about the more security you think about in terms of legal instruments and providing cooperation cross-border within the narrowly defined concepts of what is cybercrime, which I think that the convention does an excellent job of. Its intent is to harmonize what that definition is. And then you marry that with other legal instruments around data protection or privacy itself, and those are different things in and of themselves. Then you can have a comprehensive system. But saying that we shouldn't advance the security agenda because it might implicate privacy is just counterintuitive to me.
Okay, let's throw it out. There's a lot of there've been complaints about not letting the audience speak, so the rest of the time is all yours. Let's pick up and see if the people have maybe questions or comments or questions to the panel of what you've just heard. Anyone want to go first? Yes, sir, please. Could you identify your name just for the transcribers?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Abubakar Karsan. I am the Executive Director of the Union of Tanzania Press Clubs, coming all the way from Tanzania. Thank you. The biggest problem we have here is not the time to use in establishing the conventions, the treaties, but to me, I see the most important issue is once the treaties have been established, ratified, and acceded to, that's where the problem starts. We have the Lomé Convention, Lomé I, Lomé II. This is the relationship between Africa, Pacific countries. We call it ACP. The European countries, Africa, Pacific, have this convention. It has been established quite a long time ago, but it cannot be implemented because of a lot of conflicts inside. Now we have this cybercrime, which we cannot say that we sit down. We have to do something. But who will police who? Once you have given us the Gondor and Rouhani as a case to take into consideration. Now, who will make sure that this treaty, which is connecting or regulating Gondor and Rouhani, is being implemented? There will be a third country or a third establishment, and if there is a third establishment, who will establish the third establishment?
I think it's a very valid point. I'll just say something quickly and we'll go to the panel, but I want to take a few more questions as we go through it. Treaties do exist and there are several treaties that do work, but I think maybe Alexander will be better to answer some of this stuff. But the fact that you have a treaty, you have something called the International Court of Justice. People don't usually go to it because they try to make sure that whatever they're doing, they don't violate international law. Mostly. Anyway, but we'll come back to, I want that question to be answered by the panel. Let's go to somebody else here on the side had raised the hand. Sir, please go ahead.
My name is Walter Natris. I'm a consultant. You will find me at this conference with many hats on, but this is my own. So to make that clear, I'm not representing anybody I'm working for at this conference. I want to make 2 points. The first is I think you're preaching to the choir. We are probably in this room more or less converted that the Council of Europe and the Budapest Convention is a good idea. When I refer to the Minister of Macedonia, no matter how you officially call it, is saying, where are the ministers of justice? Where are the ministers of foreign affairs? Where are the secretaries of education, etc.? That may be an opportunity to bring this message across again. And unfortunately, the gentleman representing the Netherlands and the Global Space Conference in April 2015, that may be an excellent place to have a panel like this again. If you'd like to have an introduction, I can make sure that happens, but you will know the road yourself also. I think that's one. The second one, and I've told it many times in Strasbourg also, there are so many different sort of organizations working on this topic also. I have two very good examples sitting right next to me from the US and from Australia. They do it from a spam and a malware point of view. They are not police. There are certs walking around here trying to find governments to talk to, what they actually do. There's the MORG and other organizations doing standards, best practices around here that actually help mitigate the problem from a technical side. And I think this is such a multi-stakeholder topic we're talking about that by only focusing on the cybercrime part, which gets best can do the top 1%, that it's important to get everybody in the room and see where the abuse can be stopped, and then you have the real criminals left. So that's my 2 points.
Could you just, for everybody who some may know, may not, what is a cert and what is MOG?
Okay, I will try to do my best. They like to be called C-certs, which is the Computer Security Incident Response Team. You can have them in a private company, you can have them at a government, you can have them in a university. They deal with incidents happening to computer systems within their constituency, as it's called. Let's say that their membership. The MORG is the Messaging Mobile Malware Anti-Abuse Working Group, which are ISPs, direct marketing organizations, the hosting companies that come together 3 times a year, and they only do that basically now in the US and in Europe. So it's very important to find, and India since last year, sorry, thank you Betsy. So it may very be important to get this organization into Africa, into Latin America, into Asia, but they need funding for that. So who could help them with bringing them to countries where they don't get to yet, because it's a private funded something. So maybe the opportunities will arise and get the right people in to discuss this. Did I explain enough, Zee?
That was perfect, thank you. One more, if somebody wants to. Please, man, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Afif Abrougi. I'm from Tunisia. I'm actually a researcher on internet governance issues. But anyway, I actually come from a region where cybercrime laws are usually less about fraud, child pornography, or identity theft, and more about crushing political dissent or sending to jail those who express themselves or spying on citizens. Anyway, so my question is, if one of these countries actually would like to join the Budapest Convention, are there mechanisms in the convention that would ensure that these countries review their national laws, or like anything that kind of ensure that they wouldn't use the convention to do bad things?
So let me do, that's a good point. Let's do this, let's go backwards. I will take yours as a comment, I imagine, maybe not a question, but I'll open it up to anybody, maybe the private sector that want to talk about it. I'll take hers first. It looks like you may have to answer that, Alexander. And then we have a question on treaties generally, who polices who. Maybe Christopher or somebody else can take that. Thanks.
I want to underline that only countries that have legislation in place that is compatible with the Budapest Convention should actually become a party. And we make it a requirement. That means countries at the moment of accession or ratification have to have the laws in place. When a country seeks accession, we do a sort of assessment of this request. And at that point, if a country has nothing in place yet, not even a draft law of any sort, we discourage that country from pursuing this accession request. We then go and work with the country until at least a draft law is there, or in parliament, let's say, or even better, a law is in place. We ensure that. Furthermore, after a country is a party, they are also members of the Cybercrime Convention Committee that assesses the implementation by the parties. So it's a sort of not a full monitoring, but some sort of a light monitoring that is taking place, where there's a continuous assessment of the way parties implement the convention. So that is in case. However, if a country wants to misuse its law, we're getting in a bit more difficult situations. There is a naming and shaming that can take place also in a committee like this. We have to make sure that when a country, and that is part of the procedure, when a country seeks accession, we check whether the basic conditions in relation to Article 15, conditions and safeguards are in place. So we also look into that. So there are a number of, let's say, safeguards on the way to accession, and also once a country is a party. At the end of the day, if a government is so bad that they really misuse the laws, I don't think in any country it's in the laws. There's a law permitting to crush political opposition. I guess they use other laws, or they move. Very often they move the problem from the criminal justice arena into the national security arena, to take it out of that, to use that avenue, and then things get very difficult.
So I want you to respond because you had a direct response, but I wanted to say this, just so that we're talking about Article 15, and it's not clear what Article 15 is. It says that you must respect the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR, both. It actually specifically references that. And legislations that we've worked on trying to conform to this, we've actually made sure that human rights provisions, procedural aspects, ensuring that people, third-party rights are protected, all that actually goes into the legislation. We can have a further conversation. But you wanted to respond directly? Please go ahead.
Not a response really, but said you don't know if countries are really that bad. We just had the PPO passed in our country. Do
you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry. I'm Gul Bukhari, work with Bites for All in Pakistan, and which is basically a human rights organization. And whilst, I totally agree with you when you said that security and privacy, I think they're two sides of the same coin, so I don't have an issue with that. The issue is exactly what my friend here sort of articulated, and we have examples of where even provisions within the Pakistan Constitution which safeguard human rights have been overridden with recent ordinances. And there is a concern that, even at an international level, the government could possibly sort of misuse this. We would love for our government to sign up to this, but we don't even have the basic law in place, cybercrimes law. But once we do, and so on and so forth, we would want these safeguards spelled out really clearly with something like the PPO, what's it called? The
Protection of Pakistan Ordinance.
Yeah, it's Protection of Pakistan Protection Ordinance. It's a very, very draconian thingy, like it's for, yeah.
You get arrested and you're gone for 90 days. They changed it and said we made it 60 days, and then there's a trial nobody knows about. And once you're convicted, people find out. Yes.
Yeah, and that's in place. That's in place.
So the legislation on cybercrime that's pending in that country was actually assisted by the convention, which actually brings in a lot of those, undoes some of those safeguards. But what I want to do is, the gentleman who asked the first question didn't get a response to his question, who polices the policeman? But I wanted to let Christopher respond first.
So just on that last question, just to add what Alexander said, is that first, we're very sensitive to this, and we have said, and I've said several times, even during the last few days, that security cannot be a stalking horse for infringement of human rights of trying to suppress dissent. And even when some people talk about having a new global convention, some of them want to add provisions that would do exactly that get that kind of content, what they think are destabilizing sort of things, which are not, that certainly is not what's covered by the Budapest Convention, which is really saying to countries, you need to have the rule of law, and it does have human rights language in it as well. When the Budapest Convention was being negotiated, when our country acceded to it, we had a lot of discussion with our civil society and industry and others about exactly these issues, and I think it's important for countries to do that. I'd also say that with respect to mutual legal assistance, we talked about a little bit earlier, We do. We are careful when we get mutual legal assistance requests, and this goes back to being specific about what you're asking for, that if a government's coming to us and say, we'd like your help in tracing this down so we can find this person who criticized the government, we don't do that. We don't give them the evidence. There are protections that countries also can impose when dealing with other governments in terms of the evidence that's shared to make sure it's really criminal conduct that's outlined in the convention. But human rights is a very important part of this, and having the rule of law and having that kind of oversight is very important.
And also there's a requirement of dual criminality. So if there was a blasphemy case where data was being requested, blasphemy is not a crime in the US, for instance, there would be no response. International law, mutual legal assistance treaties require both countries to criminalize the same conduct. Otherwise, they don't cooperate on those. But they would cooperate on other cybercrime stuff. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
Government requests, when requests come in from governments, they have to provide some kind of a subpoena from their own courts or anything, or is it? Because there has to have been some proven judicial process before you request.
And so Article 15 requires that all procedural powers within the convention, when implemented in your country, must be through independent judicial oversight and supervision. So absolutely, you would have a warrant. Jayanta, you wanted to respond to this, but I'm again conscious of, I think you wanted to talk about policing the policeman, right?
Yeah. So on that point, I just want to say that in effective enforcement, there's another dimension to the whole aspect of empowering law enforcement, judiciary, as well as other people who are in the combat of cybercrime. And that's a dimension I want to add in terms of a benefit of signing the Budapest Convention, because you get access to a whole lot of training and capacity building that Margaret spoke about. They have a new project called GLACY, the Global Action on Cybercrime, a country that has shown a positive interest in joining the convention, get access to judicial training, law enforcement training, and our country already has benefited from a number of such options. So in effectively policing the policeman, the capacity building side is one positive aspect of the convention that I want to highlight. Thank you.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Just to respond to the question also regarding Tanzania. We have been working with Tanzania on your current draft law on cybercrime. We have reviewed it in 2 rounds. We had a workshop in Dar es Salaam, I think last year, not just for Tanzania, but for the other 4 countries of the East African community. We believe that in Tanzania, a lot of capacity building is needed, in particular with regard to the judiciary, prosecution and judiciary. I think your law enforcement is picking up and is getting started. That's okay, very good. But judicial training is very much needed. And when we do judicial training, we also have to discuss the rule of law matters, safeguards, human rights, and so on, due process matters. That's another avenue then to reinforce that. So. And we hope that also Tanzania at some point will seek accession, that also the other countries of the East African community will come closer to the Budapest Convention, and then I'm sure we can address the sort of problems you mentioned.
Christopher, go ahead.
Yeah, just one line on that. In the capacity building, I talked about the 4 sessions we've had in various regions of Africa. We talk about cybercrime, we talk about cybersecurity, but we also talk about human rights online as part of that. So we combine all these things together so that when decision makers are thinking about this, they're thinking not just about the security side, but how that affects human rights and their economic interests. We do a multi-stakeholder training. We have civil society there, we have industry there, much like the IGF.
So just a little more on the police and the policeman. You see, the way that sovereign nations work is, I don't think anybody would ever accept that there should be a government that tries and decides between 2 different nations who is right and who is wrong. That's why you have the International Court of Justice, but not everything goes to it. So I think that's a difficult one. There is no solution to policing the policeman, and you have to somehow accept or live with the fact that countries will work in a mechanism where they do not want to contravene international obligations or law most of the time. There are consequences to it that happen. So you'll find even sometimes fairly, I wouldn't say the most bad actors, but people who may be in the middle of the spectrum or slightly closer to the bad side will actually, I found at least, don't want to avoid those kind of circumstances. So I think that sort of self-governs a little bit. Bertrand, I think you had raised your hand, and if there's another question, and I want to go to remote participation after we do this round, and then it's you. Bertrand, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Bertrand de la Chapelle. I'm the director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. And I just wanted to very quickly pick on one word that Alexander has used, which is the term due process. The situations that we're addressing here, and especially in the Cybercrime Convention and the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, rely fundamentally, as Zahid just indicated, on the dual incrimination. And there are many situations where things are criminal in one country and not criminal in another one. That is not necessarily just a matter of a bad country and a good country. I mean, to give you a very concrete example, it is not a cybercrime, but there is something criminal in France regarding hate speech for historic reasons, and in Germany as well. This is not compatible legally with the First Amendment framework in the United States, and this raises a lot of concerns in the relationship between law enforcement in one country that wants to implement this and the operators or the platforms that are located in another country. So without belaboring, what I want to highlight here is that we are covering, as you said, a situation where there's no overarching decision maker between the laws of two countries. So either you have the dual incrimination, and then here you spread the frameworks like the Cybercrime Convention, and one of the components is due process. But in the other cases where there's a discrepancy between laws that are perfectly legitimate on one hand but not on the other, but it deals with speech issues, for instance, the development of frameworks that establish due process as much as possible is the only avenue that is available today.
Let me just quickly respond to that. We had 1, 2, remote participation, 3. The thing the convention does is at least lets everybody agree on dual criminality on the cybercrimes, the pure cybercrimes. So I know some people may want to view blasphemy as a cybercrime or something else, but tough luck, guys, not in this room. But the idea is that at least on those crimes, there will be cooperation because the dual criminality exists on that. Okay, go ahead.
Just a quick correction. There is a protocol to the Budapest Convention on xenophobia and racism on the internet.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was put in a protocol because it was clear from the outset that the Budapest Convention would not be ratified by a number of countries because of First Amendments or the equivalent. And therefore it was put in a protocol to that. And it also doesn't cover blasphemy as such, but it also covers religious insults, and that sort of things are covered there also. So
Sure.
Those that want to cooperate on that are free to join the protocol to the Budapest Convention.
You're nice, sir. Please identify yourself for the transcribers.
Hello? Oh, sorry.
Yep, there you go.
As a community, as an internet community, we have to talk about a safe, secure, and sustainable internet. And part of that is having government and law enforcement help protect the citizens. That's what government was created for, is to protect citizens. Yes, governments abuse that in terms of misusing the laws in place. But I think we need to do a better job of showing that there is a balance, and governments and law enforcement does have an important role to protect human rights, privacy, and cybersecurity. And if you, as I said, this is the only panel that has had government being the good guys, and all the other panels, you're the enemy.
Well, that's nice to know. Thank you, Rick. We have another question right here, and then I'll go to a remote question as well next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nicola Reis, and I'm come from the College of Europe. And my question is regarding, we've talked a lot about treaties and international law, but what about the operational dimension of fighting cybercrime? And here I'm thinking about the recent setup of the European Cybercrime Center within Europol. And I know that they've had a lot of cooperations with the United States, but I was wondering, even though the European Union has a very specific way of having a cooperating police forces, would this kind of framework be implementable in developing countries, or would this kind of framework maybe possibly be extended from outside the boundaries of the European Union to a much more global framework?
Chris, do you want to take that?
So one of the things, when I think about this problem, it's like a stool that has three legs. One is the substantive and procedural law. One is being able to cooperate internationally, and one is having trained law enforcement who can do the operational investigations, because it doesn't really matter what your laws are if you can't actually do the investigations. But that also includes judges and prosecutors and others. So as we think about this issue, and a lot of the capacity building work that's being done by, for instance, our Department of Justice does a lot of this work, is exactly that, and our FBI and others, is going and training those law enforcement authorities around the world and helping them set up cybercrime units in countries. It's very important. This is such a new area that training law enforcement to understand it, to do the forensics, to be able to actually follow it through, training the prosecutors to understand how these cases work, how to make these requests. That's really been critically important. Now, there's a lot of work to be done there, but more and more of that's being done. I think that's an important piece of this puzzle. We have talked a lot about law, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we need to actually have that personal capacity in countries around the world. Otherwise, you have the weakest link issue.
Very quickly, Alexander, and we have a remote question after this.
Yeah. We recently sent law enforcement experts from 12 countries to The Hague, to the European Cybercrime Center for training, also to get access to the training materials developed and hosted by the EC3. We are funding people from 25 countries going to Singapore in 1 month from now to the joint Interpol-Europol meeting on cybercrime. The EC3 is a partner in our project. So we have very close cooperation, and that's one of the strengths. What I'm saying, you're joining a system where we link up people all the time. We don't do everything ourselves. We link up many people, we provide platforms. EC3 is one of our partners.
Thank you. So we have a remote question. I have it right here from Gideon Rob, Connect Africa. And there's a couple of questions, but let me focus on the first one. Do we think that the developing countries need help in creating these laws, like cybercrime laws, I imagine? Let me ask, what does Ghana think? Do you need help?
Yeah, definitely. We need help because no one country can fight cybercrime alone. So there's a need for international cooperation and collaboration in our fight against this menace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take one last question. Oh, yes, maybe two last questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Zahid. My name is Betsy Broder. I'm with the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, which is a consumer protection agency. We do enforcement work, but not at the criminal level. To that, we defer, of course, to the Department of Justice. But for those countries that do not yet have a criminal framework for approaching cybercrime issues, one suggestion that I would raise is that there could be regulatory or administrative functions that could be used. Okay, we talk about the Budapest Convention as being the gold standard, and I think that is very true. But if countries are not yet at that level, what are the alternatives? So I will just give one example, which I think might be valuable. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Nigerian Economic and Financial Crimes Commission and the Nigerian Consumer Protection Council in an effort to both secure our relationship on the U.S. to Nigeria side, but also encourage the cooperation between the criminal and civil agencies in that country, and to pose as a model the way that we will work our civil cases involving consumer fraud, deceptive spam, malware, botnets, and working with our criminal partners to enhance it. So that's an alternative way of approaching things. Thank you very much, Zahid.
Thank you, Betsy. And absolutely, like MOG and APWG and what the FTC has done are fantastic. Certs, they're important ways that you can fight cyber criminals. But if you want to take them to court, well, there's only one way. Any other questions? I'll take one last one, and then we have to break. Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. Okay. Hello, good morning. I just have a quick question. Within the last 2 years, the Council of Europe invited 7 Latin American countries to join to the Cybercrime Convention. Another 7 were discussing how to conciliate their local legislation to the treaty. But the point where the debate gets stuck is always the same: freedom of speech and anonymity for countries where the institutions do not necessarily work properly. So how these mechanisms of legal cooperation, of infrastructure, can actually help to move this debate forward, because the only reason why it doesn't move forward is always the same, and it remains the same. I mean, we are not moving.
Do we have a Latin American?
Very difficult, in particular in federal countries like Argentina, like Mexico, and so on. But I think we are getting there slowly, and we have actually more requests from Latin America coming that are currently being processed. So it's not the freedom of expression thing that's the sticking point, it's the procedural law.
What I want to do is, first of all, thank everybody who was here at the panel, especially the private sector here. Really helped us out right now. Audrey, thank you so much for being here. Really helped us a lot, and especially the last minute, so really appreciate it. What I wanted to do is really quickly, take 10 seconds per person if you want to wrap up quickly, because we have to also close. Christopher, do you want to say something? We'll just go around.
Yeah, I think this is a great discussion, and I think this really is one of the key issues for developing world countries. And I'd say that, streamlining mutual assistance on an operational side, training and capacity building is critical, and having the strong law in place. So if this discussion has sparked interest in countries and in participants here, we need to follow up and build on it. And I think this is one of the practical innovations of the IGF this year.
I totally agree with you, Chris. I mean, the discussion has been extremely informative. It gives perspective on the challenges that we need to consider in the evolving nature of the whole technology space. And so, yeah, I think, thank you for your time and attention.
So the threat of cybercrime is real and fast becoming, slightly going out of control, but countries cannot just afford to wait. And when countries are moving forward with legislation, they cannot afford to work in isolation. And that's one message I want to convey. They should become part of a global community, and that is where conventions like the Budapest Convention is the most effective tool for legal reform. Thank you.